In 1819, the state of Maryland tried to impose a tax of $15,000 per year on the Second Bank of the United States. This wasn't just about a bank. It was about whether a state could actually cripple a federal institution, an argument that went all the way to the Supreme Court. This seemingly technical tax dispute, McCulloch v. Maryland, would become one of the most significant constitutional cases in U.S. history, fundamentally reshaping the balance of power between individual states and the federal government. We'll trace the precise legal arguments, the decision handdown on March 6, 1819, and the lasting impact. And by the end, you'll see exactly how Chief Justice John Marshall's opinion still dictates the reach of federal authority in 2026. When the state of Maryland tried to tax the United States government in 1818, it wasn't just a simple dispute over money. It was a fundamental challenge to the very structure of American federalism. This seemingly obscure tax battle, which ultimately reached the Supreme Court in 1819, forced a pivotal decision that would forever clarify the division of power between states and the federal government. At its core, the case of McCulloch v. Maryland asked whether Congress had powers not explicitly written in the Constitution, and if states could effectively nullify federal actions they disagreed with through taxation. This wasn't merely about a bank. It was about the sovereignty of a nascent nation. The conflict began in 1816, when the United States Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States. This institution, much like its predecessor, was highly controversial, particularly in states that favored agrarian economies over national financial systems. By 1818, the state of Maryland, aiming to assert its authority and perhaps make a profit, enacted legislation to impose a hefty tax on all banks not chartered within the state. The clear target here was the federal bank, specifically its Baltimore branch. Why would a state try to levy a tax that directly challenged federal authority, knowing it would likely lead to a constitutional showdown? The answer lies in the deep-seated resistance many states, particularly in the South and West, felt toward the Second National Bank, established by Congress in 1816. This federal institution, headquartered in Philadelphia under figures like Langdon Cheves, was designed to stabilize the nation's chaotic financial system and regulate state bank currency, but it was seen by states like Maryland as a powerful, intrusive entity. Their argument, articulated by figures like Luther Martin, was that the U.S. Constitution was silent on the subject of banks. For Maryland, the federal government had exceeded its enumerated powers by chartering such an institution, citing Article I, Section 8, and its specific list of congressional powers. They insisted federal powers must be explicit, not implied, under the 10th Amendment, and that a national bank infringed upon their sovereignty and local economic control, especially given its branches, like the one in Baltimore. This narrow interpretation of federal power set the stage for a dramatic confrontation, pushing the question of national supremacy to its absolute limit. So, how did Maryland plan to enforce its view against the federal government's own creation? How did Maryland attempt to exert its power over a federal entity, setting the stage for one of the most important constitutional battles in American history? In 1818, the Maryland General Assembly approved legislation specifically targeting the Second National Bank's operations within its borders. This wasn't a subtle move. The law mandated that any bank not chartered by the state, a clear reference to the federal institution, must either print its notes on stamped paper purchased from the state or pay an annual tax of $15,000. This was a direct financial challenge, a perceived attempt to cripple the national bank's ability to operate efficiently, and a bold assertion of state sovereignty over federal operations. James McCulloch, the cashier of the Baltimore branch of the Second Bank of the United States, refused to pay this tax, leading directly to the pivotal case of McCulloch v. Maryland. It brought the fundamental question of state taxing power versus federal operations squarely before the Supreme Court, prompting a legal showdown over what the Constitution didn't explicitly say. What was perhaps most remarkable about this pivotal legal showdown was what the Constitution didn't explicitly say. The core legal debate in McCulloch v. Maryland ultimately revolved around the interpretation of the necessary and proper clause, found in Article I, Section 8, of the U.S. Constitution. Maryland's attorneys, including Luther Martin, contended that since the Constitution contained no express provision granting Congress the power to charter a national bank, such an act was beyond federal authority. Their argument rested on a strict interpretation of necessary, suggesting it meant absolutely essential. However, lawyers representing the Second National Bank, most notably the formidable Daniel Webster, countered with a much broader view. Webster argued for a reading of implied federal powers that were conveniently useful for executing the enumerated powers, such as regulating commerce or collecting taxes. The silence of the Constitution on the explicit power to create a bank thus became the central question. Did necessary and proper restrict federal power to only what was strictly indispensable, or did it grant Congress the flexibility to choose any means rationally related to its legitimate ends? It was a question with profound implications for how the federal government would operate. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of this foundational legal battle was the speed and unanimity of its resolution. On March 6, 1819, just 3 days after oral arguments concluded, Chief Justice John Marshall delivered the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in McCulloch v. Maryland. Marshall's ruling didn't just side with the federal government. It fundamentally reshaped the understanding of federal power. He famously affirmed Congress's implied powers to create the Second National Bank, stating that the power to establish such an institution was necessary and proper for carrying out enumerated powers like taxing, borrowing, and regulating commerce. This pivotal declaration established that the federal government possesses powers not explicitly listed in the Constitution, provided they are rationally related to its expressly granted authorities. To directly counter Maryland's tax, Marshall's opinion included the indelible phrase, "The power to tax is the power to destroy," underscoring that states could not use taxation to undermine legitimate federal operations. But what did this ultimate victory mean for the enduring balance of power between the states and the federal government? But what was the ultimate, enduring impact of this landmark decision on the balance of power in the fledgling United States? The most groundbreaking aspect of the McCulloch v. Maryland decision was its robust and unequivocal affirmation of federal supremacy over state laws. Chief Justice John Marshall, with his characteristic legal precision, explicitly cited Article VI, Clause 2, the Supremacy Clause, stating that federal laws enacted in pursuance of the Constitution's provisions are indeed the supreme law of the land, overriding any conflicting state statutes. This powerful ruling meant that states, such as Maryland with its prohibitive $15,000 annual tax on the Second Bank of the United States, could not tax or otherwise interfere with legitimate federal operations. For instance, had Maryland's levy been allowed to stand, New York or Virginia could have imposed similar, crippling taxes, creating a destructive patchwork of state-by-state financial control that would effectively cripple national entities and potentially fragment the Union. This unanimous decision, delivered on March 6, 1819, by a court comprised of influential figures like Associate Justice Bushrod Washington, solidified the power of the federal government, ensuring its ability to function without being held hostage by individual states. This fundamental reshaping of the balance of power, ensuring federal over state authority in areas of legitimate federal action, persists to this day, underpinning countless federal programs and regulations. To any institution not chartered by the state, a clear reference to the Second Bank of the United States. This dispute escalated, challenging the very framework of American governance, raising questions about implied powers and the extent of federal authority that the Constitution itself hadn't explicitly detailed. Ultimately, McCulloch v. Maryland didn't just resolve a dispute over a bank. It forged the very backbone of American federalism. Chief Justice Marshall's unanimous decision established two enduring principles. The doctrine of implied powers, allowing the federal government to execute its enumerated powers through necessary and proper means, and the unequivocal supremacy of federal law over state legislation when conflicts arise. This ruling made it legally impossible for states to undermine the national government's essential functions through taxation or other legislative means, creating a robust framework for a unified nation. This video presents publicly documented information. It is for educational purposes, not legal advice. Given the complexities of federal and state powers, have you ever encountered a situation where state and federal laws seem to conflict? Share your experience in the comments below. If you found this breakdown insightful, subscribe for more deep dives into the cases that shaped our legal landscape. And if you're curious about another foundational case, watch my analysis of Marbury v. Madison next to understand the origins of judicial review.